Shalom everyone, hope everyone's doing well. Be'ezat Hashem, today in Masechet Sanhedrin we're going to learn Yud-Bet Amud Bet 12b, and we're going to start towards the bottom of Yud-Bet Amud Aleph. Tana Rabbanan, the last bright on the page. Tana Rabbanan, it's 2, 4, 6, 7 lines from the bottom of the page, Yud-Bet Amud Bet. Be'ezat Hashem, we're going to have one section on our learning today, which is going to be 4 opinions regarding the allowance, not allowance, to intercalate a year if the majority of people are tameh, and we'll see about this, what would be the reasoning to do that. And we'll see also various opinions as to what was the sin of Chizkiya. It's going to have 4 opinions here, and we'll discuss all of this, God willing, through Yud-Bet Amud Bet. Our learning today should, as always, be a zichut for a quick and speedy recovery, or refuah shalema, for Yaakov ben Dina, and we should hear Besarot Tova, we should hear only the best of news. Be'ezat Hashem, let's get started at the bottom of Yud-Bet Amud Aleph. Okay, so now like this. The Braita here is going to continue discussing, like we've been discussing from yesterday, reasons that the Beit Din would see fit or not see fit to add an extra month into the year. The scenario here that we're going to start off with is, it's a year that as Nisan approaches, the Beit Din sees majority of the people are tameh. Now, you got an issue because it's Adar, and then in Nisan you have to bring the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach is brought, it's the sacrifice brought by all the people, groups, on Pesach. But you could only bring that Korban Pesach if you're tahor, l'chaura. So would this be grounds, perhaps, to create a leap year, so you give people enough time to become tahor, because Adar will be extended to another Adar, and then people will be tahor when the Korban Pesach is to be brought on Pesach when Pesach rolls around as it's meant to be. Now, this will lead us to a very interesting discussion, which is, there is a halacha, if the majority of the Jewish people are tmeim, are not tahor, they're tmeim, so then the halacha is that actually sacrifices under those circumstances could be brought even in a state of tum'ah. It's a chidush. Usually you can't bring a sacrifice, Korban Pesach for sure not, in a state of tum'ah. But if the majority of the Jewish people are tameh, you're allowed to bring korbanot in a status of tum'ah. Now this is a unique halacha, and there are 2 shitot how this works. One shita says, Tum'ah hutra b'tzibbur. Now what does that mean? Hutra means completely permitted. If there's a situation where the majority of the Jewish people need to bring public offerings, like a Korban Pesach, it's a community thing, as we'll see, we'll get into that, they would be allowed to bring korbanot even in a state of tumah if the majority of the Jewish people are tameh. Not only are they l'chatchila, it's mutar, completely mutar. The other shita says that the leniency doesn't go so far, but rather it's tum'ah dechuya b'tzibur. We push away the tum'ah in a tzibur when the tzibur is mostly tameh, which means you're given an allowance to bring the korbanot in a state of tum'ah, but it's not a lechatchila. It means ideally, if you could figure out an alternative sort of way, so do something else that it should be done b'tahara. But if there's no option, you could bring it in a status of tum'ah. So now, the Braita discusses a scenario, Rashi says, a scenario where it looks like the Nasi is going to pass away towards the end of the year. Problem is, when the Nasi would pass away, all the tzibbur would become tameh to its body, because the Nasi was the leader of the Jewish people. So everyone's going to go be involved in the dead body of the Nasi, which means that the majority of the tzibbur, or all the tzibbur, are going to become tameh. So now Beit Din has to sit down and figure out, should they make a leap year and add an extra month, allowing the tzibbur to become tahor and bring the korban Pesach on Pesach in a state of tahara, or is it not necessary? So let's see the Braita. Tana Rabbanan says the Braita. Tanakama says, and we're going to discuss and amend this, but let's just read it as it is now. Ein ma'abrin et hashana b'pnei tum'ah. If the majority of the tzibbur, like that case Rashi brings, the Beit Din sees that the Nasi is sick and he is going to pass away, tzibbur is going to be involved in his body, this would not be grounds to make a leap year and extend it to allow them to become purified, and it would appear at face value that this Tanakama holds, Tumah hutra b'tzibur, is that the idea of Tum'ah the majority of the people being tameh, it completely permits the public offerings now moving forward, and therefore there's no reason to add an extra month. Rather, they'll all be tameh, and you'll bring a korban Pesach in the status of tuma, no problem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ma'abrin, Rabbi Yehuda says no, we do add the extra month when the majority of the people are tameh, and then Rabbi Yehuda goes on to say something that appears to contradict his initial position. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ma'abrin, this seems to imply is that it's not hutra b'tzibbur, means it's not necessarily a leniency. The majority of the people are tameh, that you could bring a korban Pesach in a status of tumah, but actually no, push off the year, add an extra month, so people become tahor. Amar Rabbi Yehuda continues, and he says, Ma'aseh b'Chizkiya melech Yehuda. There's a story with Chizkiya, who was the king of Yehuda. So Rashi explains over here that there was a king whose name was Achaz. Achaz was a wicked king who encouraged and had the Jewish people involved in Avodah Zarah. Now the Chachamim said, Avodah Zarah, if you're involved with it, it makes you tameh like tameh met. It's a tumah d'Rabbanan, but it makes you tameh like a status of tumat met. That's what Tosafot explains. So this Chizkiya was the son of Achaz. He became the new king, and he led the Jewish people in a tshuva movement. Everybody did teshuvah. The problem was he became the king, and the people had this status of tumah from the Avodah Zarah that King Achaz had the people engaged with. So Rabbi Yehuda says that there was a story with Chizkiya when he became king, Melech Yehuda, she'iber tashana mipnei tumah, that he encouraged the year and he made the year a leap year because of the tumah that the people still had from the Avodah Zarah they were involved with under his father Achaz. And afterwards he realized he had done something wrong, because really, what Rabbi Yehuda is bringing is, since most of them were tameh, it was actually allowed to be brought in their current state, so it was not necessary to make a leap year. Ubikesh rachamim al atzmo, and then he davened that he should be forgiven because he had done the wrong thing by making a leap year, because really they could have brought the korban Pesach in their status of tumah, as most of the tzibbur was tameh. How do I know this, says Rabbi Yehuda? Dichtiv, because it says in Divrei Hayamim, when it recounts this story, it says, Ki marbita am rabat me Ephraim Menashe, the majority of the people from Ephraim, Menashe, Yisachar, V'Zvulun, the different tribes, lo yitaharu, they're not tahor. Turning to Yibet Amud Bet, and the pasuk continues, Ki achlu et Pesach belo kechtov, and they ate the Pesach in the inappropriate way, which the way Rabbi Yehuda is explaining it is, he pushed it off a month, which should not have been done, and they only kept Pesach a month later. Means he made a leap year so that Pesach was kept a month later, which should not really have been done. Ki itpalel Chizkiyahu aleim lemor, and Chizkiyahu davened afterwards saying, Hashem atov yichaper ba'ad, Hashem, the good, should atone for the people, on behalf of the people. So what Rabbi Yehuda deduces from this story is that since the majority of the people were tameh, Chizkiya should not have pushed it off an extra month. They should have brought the korban Pesach timely, because when there's a tuma of the tzibbur, majority or all of the tzibbur, you could bring the korban Pesach in its time and not make a leap year. Now the Gemara is going to note that there's an obvious contradiction within Rabbi Yehuda's position, because first he says me'abrin, that when the majority of the tzibur is tameh, you do make a leap year, and then he brings a proof from the story of Chizkiya that he had done something wrong by making a leap year, because he should have done it in its time without pushing it off, because the majority of the tzibur was tameh, and that's grounds to bring the korban Pesach in a status of tumah. So the Gemara, we'll get to it soon, is going to note the obvious contradiction within the position of Rabbi Yehuda. But either way, Rabbi Yehuda is quoting that story of Chizkiya, and he seems to say what was the Aveira that Chizkiya did that he needed to pray for atonement for, was that he added the extra month, which he didn't have to, because most of the tzibur was tameh, you could bring the korban Pesach in that state. Now we go to the third opinion of the Braita. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon argues, he says, Im ipnei tuma ivrua, if you're saying that Chizkiya had extended the year because of tum'ah, he added the extra month so people would be tahor when they brought the Pesach, no, me'uberet. Actually, it's not true what you're saying, Rabbi Yehuda, that it was wrong and it wouldn't be effective. Rather, me'uberet, it would be effective, says Rabbi Shimon. Meaning, to extend the year in the situation of a tum'ah, everyone's tameh, it actually would be effective to extend the year, and that wasn't the sin of Chizkiya. So why was Chizkiya praying on behalf of himself? What had been done wrong? She'ein ma'abrin ela adar. So this is an interesting halacha. We mentioned this before. If Beit Din wants to make a leap year, they have to decide and declare a leap year before the end of Adar. But once Nisan has been sanctified, Rosh Chodesh Nisan has been sanctified, they're not allowed to make a leap year anymore. And we'll see this is based on a pasuk. So says Rabbi Shimon, the halacha is you're only allowed to intercalate the year, to add an extra month, if you're still in Adar. V'hui ber Nisan b'Nisan. But he already sanctified it when it was already Nisan. Means it was already Aleph Nisan. The Beit Din had sanctified Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and he decided, oh, this is not Nisan, this is Adar Bet. And that's Asur. That's what Chizkiya was praying for forgiveness, because that was the wrong thing to do. The Gemara is going to have to clarify this, because this is an obvious halacha that he should not have made a mistake in. But either way, he's saying that the mistake wasn't adding an extra month. It was adding an extra month when it was already Nisan. That's wrong. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, he says a third potential Aveira that Chizkiya did. Mipnei she'isiyat Yisrael la'asot Pesach sheni. Now we're going to have to explain this as well, but the issue that Chizkiya did wrong was that he advised the Jewish people who were tameh, and we'll get to exactly what the circumstances were, to make instead of Pesach Rishon, but to keep Pesach Sheni, which we know is the 14th of Iyar, becomes what's Pesach Sheni. For those who are Tameh, they're allowed to push it off to the second Pesach Sheni. And his mistake was that he encouraged them to do Pesach Sheni. They should have done it in Pesach Rishon. Now, again, we're going to have to figure out exactly what was his calculation and what was his mistake. When we get to the Gemara about his opinion, we'll get to that as well. Now let's analyze Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Mar. So we had quoted in this previous Braita, Rabbi Yehuda said that if the majority of the people are tameh, like the case the Nasi passed away, Me'abrin. So he seems to have argued in Tanakama. Tanakama said you should not make a leap year in such a circumstance, but rather keep it as it is. Means you don't make a leap year. Since the people are tameh, you keep Pesach and you bring the Korban Pesach in a status of tuma. Rabbi Yehuda said, Ma'abrin, you do make a leap year. Means you add the extra month, seemingly so people are tahor when the Korban Pesach is to be brought a month later. Alma, so the Gemara says, we see, it leila Rabbi Yehuda, tuma dechuya hi tzibbur. Remember the two positions I said about bringing a korban when the majority of the tzibbur are tameh. So Rabbi Yehuda must be of the position that tuma is just dechuya. It's just pushed off. It's not completely permissible, but it's just pushed off. Now, what does that mean? It means, according to the Tanakama, we say, tuma hutra b'tzibur. This is how we're understanding it now. Is if the majority of the public are tameh, it becomes completely permitted to bring these public offerings, no problem. Rabbi Yehuda seems to hold, why would you add an extra? He says, Ma'abrin, because he says, dechuya. No, it's a leniency that allows you to bring these public offerings, but it's not a total allowance if there's another way to get out of it. So therefore, if you have the option of making a leap year, says Rabbi Yehuda, you should make a leap year because it's only dechuya, it's a leniency if you have no other option, but if you do have another option, then you should push off the year. In this case, may add an extra month so that you could bring it in a state of tahara. So it seems like he holds tuma is just dechuya, but it's not hutra b'tzibur. The problem is we have a braita where Rabbi Yehuda seems to clearly hold hutra. V'hatanya, we have a braita that states as follows. Now, this week's parasha. In parasha Tetzaveh, we discussed the different garments of the Kohen Gadol. And Chazal tell us, each of the garments of the Kohen Gadol atoned for different averot. Now the tzitz, which was the forehead plate that the Kohen Gadol wore on his forehead, it atoned for korbanot, meaning it was a kapara, for korbanot that were brought in a state of tum'ah. Meaning if korbanot were brought in a state of tum'ah, so really it should be an issue and it shouldn't be effective. The tzitz atoned for those korbanot. Now there's a machloket in this braita. Would it atone for korbanot that are brought in the state of tum'ah, whether the Kohen Gadol was wearing it or not when that korban was brought? Or does it only atone for the korbanot that are brought in a state of tum'ah while the Kohen Gadol is wearing it? This is a machloket. So the Braita says like this, it sits, when it comes to that forehead plate that the Kohen Gadol would wear, ben sheyeshno al mitzcho u ben she'eno al mitzcho, whether he is wearing it on his forehead or not, at the time that someone brings a korban in a state of tum'ah, meratzeh, it does atone, meaning that a korban that's brought in a state of tum'ah is still going to be considered a kapara, divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that a korban that is brought in a state of tum'ah, it's considered atoned for, even if the Kohen Gadol is not currently wearing his tzitz. Rabbi Yehuda says, Odo al mitzcho meratzeh. if it's on his forehead while this korban was brought in appropriately, so it acts as an atonement. Right? But if he's off duty and he's not wearing it currently, and they brought a korban in that state of tuma, it wouldn't act as an atonement. So the Braita continues. Amar Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yehuda, I'll prove to you that it acts as an atonement, the tzitz, regardless if he's currently wearing it when the korban was brought in tuma or not. Because Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. I'll bring you a proof from the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Now, what happened on Yom Kippur? We know the Egel HaZahav, which was a great sin the Jewish people did, was made out of gold. Because of that, much of the avodah of the day that the Kohen Gadol did on Yom Kippur, which was a day of atonement, was without the golden garments, the 4 golden garments that he wore, and he only wore the 4 white ones. Because we don't want, as the concept of ein kategor na'aseh sanegor. The prosecutor can't be the defender. So if this is a reminder of the Avera ve'egel, you shouldn't wear it while you're doing the kapara on Yom Kippur. So says Rabbi Shimon, on Yom Kippur, the majority of the day, much of the day, he's not wearing those golden garments. He's not wearing the tzitz. She'eno al mitzcho, so he's not wearing it. And yet, umeratzeh, we know it does act as an atonement, meaning we know on Yom Kippur that the reality is that even though he's not wearing the tzitz, nonetheless, it still acts as an atonement if a korban is brought in a state of tuma. Because we know that that's the halacha. If some sort of tuma happened in the kodshim, the tzitz would still atone for it. So says Rabbi Shimon to Rabbi Yehuda, you see clearly the Kohen Gadol does not have to be wearing the tzitz in order for it to act as a coverage, an atonement for a korban brought in tuma. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda said back to Rabbi Shimon, Hanach le Yom Kippurim. Don't bring a proof from Yom Kippur. Leave aside Yom Kippur. Now listen to this. Shetumah hutra b'tzibbur. Why? Since the offerings the Kohen Gadol is bringing are public offerings, that's like the tzibbur is bringing public offerings. And therefore, says the Gemara, says Rabbi Yehuda, in regards to public offerings, you don't even need the tzitz to act as an atonement for it, because tum'ah hutra b'tzibbur. Public offerings that are brought in a state of tum'ah are considered permitted because as a public offering it has the special halacha of tum'ah hutra b'tzibbur. So really you can't bring a proof from there. Really the tzitz would not act as an atonement when he's not wearing it. In the case of Yom Kippur, since it's public offerings, tuma hutra b'tzibur, it makes the korban that's a public offering considered as totally permissible. Even l'chatchila, it's considered totally permissible. Now the kasha that the Gemara is asking is, you see clearly from Rabbi Yehuda's position here that he holds tuma hutra b'tzibur. He holds that when there's a status of tuma, either a korban of a tzibur or the korbanot that are brought when majority of the tzibur are tameh, either way, it's not dechuya. It's not just that you're allowed to bring it in a state of tuma, but like dechuya, but if you could figure something else out, it would be better. But rather, he holds it's completely permitted. So now the Gemara asks a contradiction. In our previous braita, we said Rabbi Yehuda said me'abrin. Why would you push off the air if majority of the Jewish people are tameh? Because he holds dechuya. Because if he held hutra, just bring the korban Pesach in a state of tuma. But in this braita, clearly he holds hutra. So it seems to be Rabbi Yehuda contradicts his own opinion. Now the Gemara retorts with a question with a question. Now what does that mean? He says, the Gemara now turns back and says, why are you bringing a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda from an outside source? I'll show you within the context of his words in this braita itself, he seems to contradict himself. The way you're asking, you're interpreting that his opinion me'abrin in the braita is he holds dechuya, and the opinion in this braita that we just quoted holds hutra. But I'll show you in the braita itself, the first braita we quoted, he seems to say in the story with Chizkiya, the concept of hutra itself, which contradicts himself inherently. Because what did he say? He'll contradict himself. Because first, Rabbi Yehuda says in the beginning, me'abrin. If majority of the tzibur tameh, add an extra month so that they'll bring the korban Pesach b'tahara, because dechuya is just a leniency, but if you could figure out an alternative solution, that's better. So from the psak that he argues in the Tanakama, he holds dechuya. But then, V'amar Rabbi Yehuda, we noted this before, Rabbi Yehuda continued and he said in the Braita, Ma'aseh b'Chizkiya melech Yehuda, there's a story with Chizkiya melech Yehuda, she'eberet hashana, he made a leap year, he added an extra month, tuma, because the majority of the people were tameh from Avodah Zarah, u'bikesh rachamim al atzmo, and afterwards Rabbi Yehuda said, he davened because he shouldn't have added an extra month, because hutra b'tzibbur, because you're allowed to bring a korban, the korbanot Pesach, when the majority of the tzibbur are tameh, it's hutra. So it seems to be from the Braita itself he's contradicting himself if he holds dechuya or hutra. So Ella, the Gemara says it must be to resolve the contradiction between in the Braita itself as well as between the Braitaot, that we have to amend the Braita, the first Braita, and clarify the positions. So let me just explain this outside and then we'll see it inside. What the Gemara is going to do is you have to amend the words a little bit. Really the Tanakama holds dechuya, and Rabbi Yehuda holds hutra. Okay, we're switching the opinions, and let's see how it fits in the words now. This is how you have to explain the Braita. Tanakama says as follows: Ein ma'abrinet hashana mipnei tuma. The Tanakama holds dechuya. So lechatchila he says, even though I hold dechuya, so you should still not make a leap year because of tum'ah. And this we're going to explain this a little more later. But Tanakama holds dechuya. Tanakama holds that really in general you can use that leniency unless you have another option. Nonetheless, to make an extra leap year, it's not necessarily acceptable. So ein ma'abrinet hashana mipnei tum'ah. You shouldn't do it lechatchila. Ve'im ivrua me'uberet. But since he holds tum'ah is dechuya, so therefore im ivrua, if you did make a leap year, since again dechuya means it's not totally permitted, but if you could figure out an alternative solution, that's also good, it's better. So if you did make a leap year when the majority of the tzibbur are tameh, so they bring the korban Pesach in a status of tahara, me'uberet, it is effective. Because the Tanakama doesn't hold hutra, holds dechuya. If you hold hutra, it wouldn't even be effective, which we're about to illustrate in Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eina me'uberet. So we're changing it now. This is changing the opinion. Rabbi Yehuda holds hutra b'tzibur. Since it's hutra, you had to bring the korban Pesach in the first month, even though everybody was tameh, because it's considered permitted when the majority of the tzibur are tameh. Not just allowed, but it's totally allowed. It's permissible. So therefore, if you add the extra month when the majority of tzibur are tameh, it's not a leap year because the right time is actually the first month, like you were supposed to. And on that, and then he quotes a story from Chizkiya, which illustrates this newfound position of Rabbi Yehuda. He holds hutra. Since Chizkiya should have brought the korban Pesach in the first opportunity when they were all tameh, and he didn't, that was considered wrong because people ended up bringing the korban Pesach in the wrong time because that's not considered ibur shana as it was hutra in the first place. Okay, so what comes out now is the Tanakama holds dechuya, and therefore, lechatchila, you shouldn't extend the year if the majority of the public is tameh, but if you do, it is effective. Rabbi Yehuda holds hutra, so therefore, you can't extend the year. If you do, it's not even effective because that is the time to bring it when everyone's tameh. Asks the Gemara, Ihachi, but what was the third opinion in the Braita? We had Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said, the issue of Chizkiya was not the tum'ah, because if tum'ah was the issue, meaning if it was an issue of tumah when he made a leap year, it would be effective. So that wasn't the issue actually. So the Gemara says, but wait a second. Comes out that according to Rabbi Shimon, he seems to be saying the same as the Tanakama now. Tanakama said you could, if you extend the year when majority of tzibur is tameh, it's effective. And Rabbi Shimon says it's also effective. So what's the machloket now between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon omer if Chizkiya would have extended it because of tumah, it would be effective. Hainu Tanakama. So what's now indeed the difference between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon? So Rava explains, really, both Tanakam and Rabbi Shimon hold dechuya. But lechatchila ika beinayu. The machloket between them is lechatchila. So what does it mean? They both hold dechuya. And now therefore what comes out is as follows. According to Rabbi Shimon, since you only hold dechuya, tuma is dechuya b'tzibur. That means if you don't have another option, so then bring a korban in a state of tuma if the majority of the public are tameh. But since you have an option to extend the year, lechatchila, you should extend the year, and then in a month from now, when Pesach rolls around, based on the new count, you'll be able to bring it in a state of tahara. Now, Tanakama agrees dechuya, so b'di'evid, if you did it, it's going to be effective. The month is binding, but he still says lechatchila to make an extra month, that's not necessarily right. So therefore, don't do it lechatchila, but b'diavad, if you did, it would be effective. Now Rabbi Yehuda disagrees outright, he's the third opinion, and he holds tuma hutra b'tzibbur. Lechatchila, do it in that month actually, because lechatchila, it's completely permissible, tuma hutra b'tzibbur, it's completely permitted. So the Gemara says, Tanya Nami Hachi, and the Braita supports this new understanding, as the Braita says as follows. Ein ma'abrin et hashana mipnei tum'ah lechatchila. The Tanakama says, you should not extend the year because of tum'ah lechatchila, but he means to say is, if you did it, would still be effective. Rabbi Shimon Omer me'abrin lechatchila, you could extend it, and lemipnei ma bikesh rachamim al atzmo. And then Rabbi Shimon finished off, as we saw in the Braita before, what's the reason that Chizkiya therefore davened? He had perfect, acceptable reason to extend the year. Because as we said, is that you're only supposed to extend the year, add the extra month, if it hasn't yet reached Nisan. But if it's already reached Nisan, which it seems to be, is what Rabbi Shimon says with the Aveirav Chizkiya, that was wrong, that would not be effective, and that's why he did something that was considered incorrect. Okay, let's move on now. Now we're going to analyze the position of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said the Aveirav Chizkiya was that the only way Chachamim can add that extra month is if you haven't reached Nisan yet. But once you reach Nisan, you can't. And therefore, for him to change Nisan back to being Adar, that was the Aveirah that he did, that he davened for. The problem the Gemara is going to say is, this is a Mefurish Pasuk that teaches us this. He had to have known that halacha. So Amar Marsh, Ein ma'abrin ela Adar v'hu yiber Nisan b'Nisan. Asks the Gemara, did Chizkiya not know this is a drasha, which is that we learn this month shall be established for you, referring to Nisan. Nisan, this refers to the month of Nisan. And the way we expound the pasuk is ve'ein achar Nisan. Once the month is established as Nisan, you can't add any extra months. Everybody knows that halacha. So you can't tell me that Chizkiya made such a fundamental mistake. So the Gemara says, no. His mistake was a little more nuanced. It was a little more particular. As we're about to explain, Ta'abid Shmuel. He made a mistake in a psak of Shmuel. Let me explain this outside and then we'll see it inside. Shmuel holds as follows. Everyone knows you can't extend and add an extra month after Nisan's reached. Nisan, it's the new year. There's nothing to talk about. Shmuel says, it's not only when Nisan reaches, but if the 30th day of Adar reaches, you're also not allowed to add an extra month. Rabbinically. Now, why is that? Because the 30th day of Adar could theoretically be Aleph Nisan. So therefore, meaning, because Adar could either be 29 days or 30 days. If it's 29 days, the 30th day of Adar, we're calling it would really be Aleph Nisan. So Shmuel says, once the 30th day of Adar has reached, even if the court did not declare it Rosh Chodesh, you're no longer allowed to make a leap year. If the Beit Din wants to declare a leap year, it has to be before the 30th day of Adar. Now, Chizkiya made a mistake. He didn't know this, or he made a mistake in this halacha, and he declared a leap year, added the extra month on the 30th of Adar. That's a much more nuanced issue, but he didn't make a mistake bichlal, that it was already Nisan, and he declared Adar Sheni. Let's read that inside. Shmuel says, you're not allowed to declare the extra month on the 30th of Adar, because that's already a day that could theoretically be Nisan if Adar was 29 days. If the Chizkiya made a mistake, he thought, we don't hold of this necessarily, you don't have to argue like this, and you could declare a leap year on the 30th. So therefore, he made a mistake, and that's what he was davening, because he should have known the psak of Shmuel. Now, it's worth mentioning here, Shmuel is an Amora. Chizkiya was one of the kings of Yehuda in the times of Bayit Rishon. So we're talking about more than 500 years, maybe 700 years between, I'd say about 700 years between Shmuel. Chizkiya preceded Shmuel by 700 years, but it means he should have known that shita. It was Shmuel's shita said later, but that was a shita people knew about, and he made that mistake. Tani Nami Hachi, the Braita teaches us, similarly, you cannot extend the year, add the extra month if it's already the 30th of Adar, Nisan, because it's already a day that would theoretically be fitting to establish as Nisan, and therefore it's no longer such an allowance. Now this was the fourth opinion in the Braita, and with this final piece we'll finish up for the day. We had the fourth opinion was Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Shimon. He said, what was the mistake of Chizkiya? Is that he pushed people who were tameh to bring the korban Pesach on Pesach Sheni, but really he should have allowed them to bring it on Pesach Rishon. So the Gemara here tries to figure out exactly what was this error. What is this fourth shita? Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon Meshe Yisiat Yisrael Asod Pesach Sheni. He encouraged the Jewish people to keep Pesach and Pesach Sheni, to bring the Korban Pesach then, and not in Pesach Rishon. So the Gemara says Echidami. What is the case over here exactly? Meaning, what was this mistake? And again, it's a similar question to we had before in Rabbi Shimon, is everybody knows that if majority of people are tameh, so for example, so then you keep it in Pesach Rishon. It's a tuma hutra b'tzibbur, for example. So what was the mistake then that Chizkiya made, pushing people to keep Pesach Sheni? Amar Rav Ashi says, he said it was a unique circumstance based on a machlok in Masechet Pesachim. This is very interesting. Let me explain this outside. There is a machloket in Masechet Pesachim if women are obligated in Korban Pesach. Do they have a chovah, that they have an obligation to be part of Korban Pesach? Or is it a reshut? It's an allowance. They have voluntary allowance. And as we're about to see, what happened was the number of people tameh, when calculated with the women and without the women, changed if there was a majority of tahor people or a majority of tameh people. So initially Chizkiya held one way, and then he realized he made a mistake and paskin the other way. And this swayed if you were allowed to have those people that were tameh bring Korban Pesach on the first Pesach, or if they had to be pushed off till the second as individuals. So let's see that inside. Very interesting. What happened was, the Jewish people, the men, let's say like this, were literally means half tameh and half tahor. But Rashi points out over here that's a little bit misleading. Really what it means is, we should go through this Rashi. There were more tameh men than tahor men. So if you just took the men into account, you'd say the majority of the men are tameh, and therefore you should bring the Korban Pesach actually in the first Pesach. Okay. V'nashim mashlimot letehorim ve'odfot aleihem. But the women who were mostly tahor, added together with the men who were tahor, made it that there would be more people tahor than tameh. So me'ikara savar, originally Chizkiya thought, Nashim barishon chova, women are obligated in Korban Pesach in the first Pesach, and therefore he thought they should be added into the calculation. So it turns out the majority of the tzibbur are tahor, and therefore if the majority are tahor, so there's only individuals are tameh, they get pushed off to the second Pesach. That's why he encouraged them to keep the second Pesach. Tahavu mi'utan tmeim, because there are only minority individuals who are tameh. And those individuals are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But in the end, he understood, Nashim barishon reshut. No, women in the first Pesach is only voluntary, so they should not be taken into the account, into the number. And therefore, dahavu lahu tmeim ruba. It turns out the majority of the nation are tmeim, and therefore the Korban Pesach should have actually been brought in the state of tuma in Pesach Rishon, and it shouldn't be pushed off the Pesach Sheni. That was his mistake, and that's why after he said, I made a mistake, shouldn't have pushed it off, because the majority shouldn't be calculated, including the women, as says, according to the Shita, as they are only a reshut, a voluntary inclusion in Korban Pesach. That was the mistake that Chizkiya made. Okay, we're stopping at the two dots toward the bottom of Yud Bet and Mud Bet. Bezrat Hashem will continue on tomorrow with Yud Gimel and Mud Aleph. In the meantime, I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom, a wonderful day, all the best. Till next time, all the best.